Thank you. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Tom and Denise and company and CG Kim. Why does it feel like today's the first day of school? I used to be in the office when I was at the NSC probably by about 7 a.m. So something has happened to make this feel earlier in the morning to me now than it used to be. But thank you for coming. It's been quite an eventful summer in East Asia. East Asia is the part of the span of Asia that I know the best and watch the most closely. We've had 2 ICBM launches from North Korea, an intermediate-range ballistic missile over Japan. We've had a probably thermonuclear test. We've had dire warnings of fire and fury. Large-scale annual U.S.-South Korean defensive exercise, a new UN Security Council resolution, 2575, interesting resolution that I'm happy to talk about. And as Tom mentioned yesterday, the announcement of the existence of an elite South Korean assassination unit. So I'm not actually sure I'm ready to go back to school after that. Moreover, here in the U.S., at least according to the president, China has either done its very, very best to get China to help on North Korea, or it hasn't done nearly enough. Depends on which tweet you're reading. Similarly, the president of South Korea is either a staunch ally of the United States, as the president said in June when President Moon visited him in Washington, or prone to appeasement, as he tweeted. Kim Jong-un is alternately, quote, very wise and makes well-reasoned decisions, or as the president said to Rodi Duterte, a madman with nuclear weapons. Somebody with nothing better to do than to launch missiles. And the UN's resolution itself, the sanctions, are either, according to Nikki Haley, very, very significant, or according to President Trump, no big deal, nothing much. I haven't checked with the North Koreans, but I think it's fair to say that our friends are a little bit confused about the messaging coming out of the administration. What else is going on? Well, the Malaysian Prime Minister, aka Malaysian official number 1, just had a fruitful day in the White House yesterday, despite the allegations of large-scale embezzlement. Aung San Suu Kyi has fallen from grace in the eyes of many Westerners because of the fighting between the Burmese military and the armed Rohingya elements within Rakhine State, and that has prompted another humanitarian crisis in a long series of tragic events. In the Philippines, we see opposition beginning to emerge to the trigger finger high casualty drug war led by President Duterte, but even that is being overshadowed by the battles in Mindanao against rebels, against violent extremists who are increasingly aligned with ISIS, which really highlights the vulnerability of these loosely governed spaces in Southeast Asia to violent extremism. And the world's 2 most populous countries, both major nuclear powers, China and India, seem to come perilously close to blows in the border area near Bhutan, possibly saved, at least in part, by the timing of the BRICS summit, where it would have been very, very inconvenient politically for the host, President Xi Jinping, to be embroiled in a confrontation that spoiled that particular party. And now in the week ahead, of course, we have the UN General Assembly coming, and from East Asia, at least, we have Prime Minister Abe of Japan, President Moon of South Korea, President Modi, I think. These are some of the prominent regional leaders who will come. Many countries from Asia, East Asia, are being represented this year at the foreign ministers level. President Trump is expected to host a trilateral, three-way summit with both President Moon and Prime Minister Abe. That's an initiative begun by President Obama. It will focus, of course, on North Korea. And North Korea is uppermost on his mind, and I'd say that North Korea, in enforcing the sanctions, both UN sanctions and also other unilateral national sanctions, will be at the top of Secretary Rex Tillerson's agenda with his counterparts, although, at least by historical standards, his stay in New York is going to be remarkably brief. The two other big events I'd put on your screen for the fall, which are, first, the Chinese Communist Party's 19th Party Congress, scheduled to begin on October 18th, where we will learn if Xi Jinping prevails in filling the Standing Committee of the Politburo with a loyalist leadership lineup to his liking. If he succeeds, that could set the stage not only for him to expand his power and authority within the party and within the nation, but also to extend his tenure in office, perhaps. And in November, you will see the Asia travel of President Trump. It's shaping up to be a marathon trip to Beijing, to Seoul, to Tokyo, and then on to the APEC meetings in Vietnam and the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN-based meetings hosted in the Philippines. So that will be quite an adventure. As Tom mentioned, I'm just back over the weekend from some time in Seoul, South Korea. I found the public and government officials that I met with pretty concerned. Some of them are very worried about that impetuous, erratic leader with nuclear weapons in Pyongyang. Some of them are worried about the leader in Washington, D.C. And the concerns take a couple of forms. There are serious questions being raised, not only in Seoul, but in Japan as well, about the reliability of America as a security guarantor. In South Korea, I heard pretty widespread calls for the reintroduction of what are called tactical nuclear weapons that had been withdrawn by the first President Bush back in the 90s following the end of the Cold War. And I found considerable anxiety that sort of fell into what felt like three basic buckets. One was a set of questions about whether or not there was a real risk that the Trump administration would launch a preemptive attack or war against North Korea that would have undoubtedly devastating effects on South Korea and the population there. A second was anxiety that perhaps President Trump would bypass Seoul and fall into the trap, as it's seen in South Korea, of dealing directly with Kim Jong-un, of granting the North Korean leader the face and the stature that he craves, and playing into Kim Jong-un's game of both marginalizing South Korea, weakening our alliance, and squeezing concessions out of Washington in exchange for what have turned out in the past to be empty promises. And a third set of concerns I found is simply the idea that the U.S. might just choose to abandon South Korea, learn to live with nuclear North Korea, and basically leave the Republic of Korea to fend for itself. But look, I mean, the short answer is that when you strip away some of the noise and tweets and the rhetoric and so on, fundamentally the North Korea policy and frankly the Asia policy of the Trump administration looks a lot like the Asia policy and the North Korea policy of the Obama administration. And there's a pretty good reason for it, which is that despite the fact that the occupant of the White House will change on January 20th after an election, or most elections, U.S. national security interests don't change. And so it makes sense for there to be continuity. In the case of North Korea, the continuity, the ingredients of the strategy are very strong deterrence, very strong alliance defense, very strong sanctions, and a willingness to keep the door to serious dialogue and serious negotiations open for whenever the North Koreans decide, presumably as a result of pressure and sanctions, to change course and open real negotiations. Now, I know that it's very tempting to say, well, sanctions haven't worked, you know, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I'm not suggesting that sanctions are any kind of a magic wand, but they are an important tool. And frankly, they're one of a finite number of tools in our kit box. And in the absence of that magic wand, it certainly appears that the only peaceful way to divert Kim Jong-un from his current course of action and induce him, if not coerce him, to come to the negotiating table, not to dictate terms, but to negotiate, is to keep raising the costs to the North Korean regime of defiance until Kim Jong-un really finds that he can't move forward. But let me stop here in keeping with Tom's injunction that we should have a conversation and not a lecture. And let's open the floor to questions.
I have no injunctions. If we're back in school, you're the professor and I'm a student. I will just ask a couple of questions. Maybe one comes to mind on South Korea and maybe another about China, and then we'll go to the room. It's interesting. I mean, and I said to a couple of people just prior, we were talking about how so many of the conversations about North Korea, and you've said it yourself now, they're the same. Whether you're talking about solutions or the problem itself year after year. On the other hand, you also put your finger on something that seems to have changed incredibly dramatically in the series of events, and that's, you said there's talk about the reintroduction of tactical nuclear weapons in the South. We mentioned a moment ago the cruise missile tests. The new president in Korea, we ought to remind ourselves, was elected, I think it's fair to say, on a fairly pacifist line, anti-even the missile defense installments that the U.S. is providing. Can you assess from your conversations that sea change? Is it a sea change? Is that pacifist element still strong, or have events overtaken that?
Well, President Moon was the chief of staff to former President Roh Moo-hyun, who was the champion of the Sunshine Policy of seeking engagement with North Korea, and certainly represents the liberal or the progressive side of the Korean political spectrum. Even during the campaign, however, he sought to balance his interest in engagement and dialogue with a strong endorsement of the U.S.-South Korean alliance. So not only was candidate Moon and is President Moon not an extremist, but as chief of staff to Roh Moo-hyun, I think he is uniquely positioned to understand what worked and what didn't work in the Sunshine Policy. And I, for one, have seen no indications that he intends merely to replicate that. Mm-hmm. He has tried to govern from the middle, largely. Moreover, Kim Jong-un has made it impossible, as a practical matter, as a political matter, to talk about engaging in dialogue at this time. Mm-hmm. So, notwithstanding the fact that the South Korean government in July launched 2 big trial balloons. One was an effort to stage family reunion talks that would allow displaced South and North Koreans to see elderly family members, something that's purely a humanitarian gesture that should have no political barrier to it, but does. And also he proposed, I think sensibly, direct military-to-military talks between South and North across the DMZ. And he got the back of the hand from Kim Jong-un, really just a deafening silence in response to those overtures. A few ballistic missiles and thermonuclear tests later, President Moon and the Moon administration senior officials are the first to acknowledge that this is just not the time to be trolling for dialogue. Kim Jong-un not only isn't in the mood to talk, he's in active defiance of the international community, and the work at hand is to increase pressure and to up the enforcement of sanctions, not as punishment, but to make clear that there is no chance of ultimate success in Kim Jong-un's threat strategy. That doesn't mean for a moment that the Moon government has abandoned its hopes for inter-Korean dialogue any more than the U.S. government abandoning our hopes for authentic dialogue that includes the nuclear issue front and center. But neither the Moon government nor I think the Trump administration is under any illusions about what is possible with North Korea in the short term, given the really frenetic pace of Kim Jong-un's demonstrations and technical tests.
All right, thank you. Now, I said I had a China question, and in the, I guess you could spend this whole hour talking about the China factor in this. But you talked about sanctions and that's a sort of old idea, but still worth pursuing. The China secondary sanctions has felt like the newest of those old concepts and ideas. And I believe, actually, it was discussed by both one of the few areas of agreement in the Clinton and Trump campaigns that, in other words, sanction the companies in China that continue to do business. I think there's been one blip of that. Is that showing any sign of working? Does it have any, in the sort of cocktail of bad options here, where do you put that as a viable lever?
Well, thanks, Tom. I think the first point is that I believe passionately, from my experience, that there is no peaceful settlement of North Korea's nuclear threat that doesn't involve very significant, very close cooperation, not only between the 3 allied capitals, Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo, but also Beijing. And that rather than the U.S. being in the role of enforcer coercing China to adhere to international sanctions and to do more, that we need to apply all of our political and diplomatic assets in consultations with the Chinese to narrow some of the areas of divergence in terms of our priorities and strategic interests, and to build on our common interest in denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. But that's easier said than done. Now, throughout the years in which sanctions have moved steadily forward and expanded and tightened, we, the West, with Seoul and Tokyo, have systematically eliminated all of the easy answers in terms of limiting North Korea's ability to proliferate or its ability to generate hard currency to fund its nuclear and missile programs. What is left after wave of both international and unilateral national sanctions are really those covert and often illegal operations that continue to provide services to North Korean front companies and enable North Korea to evade sanctions and to operate. I think that it's misleading shorthand to talk about it as Chinese sanctions or secondary sanctions on China or Chinese entities, although without a doubt the lion's share of the transgressors, the banks and companies, are Chinese or are located in China. But there are Russians as well. There are Middle East operators as well. And the point is not that this is somehow punishing China. The point is that the North Koreans are reduced to the last, X% of available business partners. Many of them are buried underground pretty deep. And because the lion's share, almost the totality of North Korea's engagement in commerce with the world is conducted via China for geographic and other reasons, most of those front companies, banks, and operations are in China. What we ought to want and what we should pursue is not the long arm of American law reaching out and having the Treasury Department or the enforcement arm of the U.S. government designating them. We want the Chinese authorities to implement national Chinese law, to implement the UN Security Council sanctions, and to roll up these businesses. Wherever the U.S. Treasury or intelligence community in cooperation with South Korea and Japan gets evidence, we pass it to the Chinese. There's been, I'd say, something of a spotty record in terms of enforcement, but it's the goal and the responsibility of diplomats to continue to raise this and to press the Chinese authorities to do more. Now, I will say, not as an apology, but as a reality, that I have a certain amount of sympathy, a limited amount of sympathy for the Chinese government, in that this is a hell of a long border. It's a very complicated business in remote areas of China. Molecular level, so to speak. And the North Koreans have, over the years, developed very effective and sophisticated deception and coping mechanisms that entail the unlimited manufacture of new passports, new identities, new names, new corporate paperwork. And it becomes no small challenge to stamp it out. That said, there is an urgency to China doing much, much more. And ironically, one of the unintended byproducts of effective sanctions is that it drives up the premium to a Chinese businessman for providing services or selling goods to North Korea. What would have cost 100 renminbi or $1 million in the past might now be worth 5 or even 10 because of the headwinds that North Korea is facing in obtaining hard currency or in obtaining foreign goods.
Good time to be a sanction buster, huh? To the room, Jerry Cohen.
Thanks for these valuable...
We have mics should be either next to you or near you or in front of you. You can just press the red button.
Thanks for these valuable opening remarks. I think the open statement in South Korea that they're having a decapitation group is probably the most vivid symbol, not only of confusion and the divisions of opinion in the South, but of desperation, demoralization. And I'm glad that I don't live in Seoul at this point, as many of my friends do. But I want to follow up on your very commendable idea that the U.S. and China try to narrow the gap. Of course, one of the worries that China has in trying to make sanctions more effective is they might prove too effective. And that leads to the question of the instability potential of the North Korean government. And that leads to the uncertainty that has to be generated in Beijing as well as elsewhere about what if there is instability in the North? What is going to happen? Who is going to do what? U.S., South Korea, China? And what would happen in North Korea? Whom would people work with? Now, in this context, a very interesting article appeared that you may have seen the other day by Jia Qingguo, the professor at Peking University, International Relations, suggesting that maybe the time has finally come for China and the U.S. to discuss what are the likely options if there's instability in the North. This is a crucial question. I gather China has not been willing to discuss this until now. I don't know whether the Chinese government would be willing now. But what do you make of Jia Qingguo's piece? Is it his own initiative? Is it a reflection, perhaps, of what some officials in the Chinese government think the time has come for discussions? Is it a warning to North Korea? An important, influential Chinese scholar close to the government says, maybe we ought to be thinking about the consequences of instability. What do you make of this piece? He's a great fellow. I had him here for the Council on Foreign Relations years ago to talk about cross-strait relations. I was fascinated. It seemed a breakthrough in public discussion. We read so many op-eds that are so similar, talking about the various sanctions and the options that are so limited. I'd love to know what you make of this.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Jerry, and thanks for all that you do. Just to your first point on this decapitation unit, I think that both that story and I think the fact that it is being made public tells us that this is a lot more for show, for psychological impact than any kind of military doctrine. But that and the very public call for reintroduction of tactical nuclear weapons is best understood as an expression of anger and an expression of frustration on the part of so many in not just the public in South Korea, but also in the government. I mean, you raised two really intriguing questions. One is, does Jia Qingguo speak for Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership? And secondly, what are the prospects for some kind of significant contingency planning between China and the U.S. or between China, the U.S. and South Korea? I am very, very, very fond of Jia Qingguo. I think very highly of him, and in fact, spent the better part of the day with him in Asia just a week ago, and had an extensive conversation with him as well.
Maybe you're behind this.
No. But I will say that what I heard from Jia Qingguo is what I file in my personal basket of too good to be true. I'll just confess that after 3 decades of dealing with Chinese diplomats, Chinese scholars, and so on, I'm very, very wary of investing too much hope in that one Chinese scholar who makes great sense to me and seems to agree with mainstream American thinking and approach. I hope it is. I wish there were 1.3 billion more Jia Jingguos. I think he's very sensible, very constructive, but I wouldn't base a policy on the broken twigs and bent blades of grass, these little clues that suggest that maybe this is what people are thinking. There's a long tradition in China of sort of bracketing a problem and allowing scholars to explore and experiment with ideas on the left side, on the right side of the target, so to speak. When I was in Beijing now almost 4 weeks ago, I was in a closed-door conference with quite a few PLA and former PLA senior officers. And I think that there is a real intellectual and policy experimentation going on, and that judging by the kinds of questions that I got, including why don't you Americans just take out Kim Jong-un? We wouldn't have a big problem with that. There is the same kind of frustration, the same kind of worry that you see in Seoul, that is felt in Washington. But where you stand is a function of where you sit. And if you sit in Beijing or in Jilin province, let alone if you're a member of the PLA, you have a very, very different set of concerns than the Pentagon or the White House. Now, for years in government, my colleagues and I beseeched our Chinese counterparts to engage in both serious and candid discussions about the future of Northeast Asia, what our goals are, what could we live with, what are we trying to do here, what matters. And more specifically, including when Mike Mullen was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when General Dunford became the chairman, an effort to set up some kind of confidential planning discussion, or even just a blue sky discussion between the Pentagon and the PLA about the what-ifs in connection with a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, because it is virtually self-evident that it is far better to have thought through and talked through various scenarios and contingencies in advance than to have to wing it in a crisis, particularly if the scenario that you might be contemplating includes such combustible ingredients as U.S. special forces that may be on the hunt for fissile material and nuclear weapons, South Korean Rangers and military, the Chinese PLA, the Eastern or Northern Division, the potential chaos in North Korea, and the threat and the risk of loose nukes. In a scenario like that, not only do you want people to be working from a plan rather than to improvise, you really have to worry about the risk of a U.S. unit, a South Korean unit, and a Chinese unit coming face-to-face, gun-barrel to gun-barrel in a high-tension scenario. But by and large, I think the reaction of the Chinese was Very negative, partly because I think there's a deficit of trust, partly out of a sense that to talk about the very thing you don't want to have happen is to taunt the gods. And lastly, because I think that whether it's because they believe the U.S. can't keep a secret or another reason, the prospect of North Korea finding out that the PLA was sort of plotting with the Americans was too daunting. But look, times are changing, and the formerly unthinkable now constitutes a problem set that we really do need to think about. And I believe that there is some increased prospect for that. I don't think that it will be revealed in an op-ed by a Chinese academic if it happens, but anything that can be done to hasten the day ought to be done.
Yes, sir. And if you don't mind just saying who you are.
Sure.
That'd be great.
I'm Charles Kimball with the Korea Center for International Finance. In terms of the enforcement of the sanctions, I presume U.S. Navy would be involved. North Korea has a history of using torpedoes to sink boats. What do you think President Trump's response would be if that happened? Because he would certainly have a large increase in will to do something in public support. So what do you think he would do if that happened?
And do we presume, actually, back to the previous question, that this kind of wargaming has been, I assume General Mattis and others have been thinking about all this stuff. But
All right. Well, I've been trained by men in lab coats through my career in government not to answer hypothetical questions. That may not.
You're at the Asia Society
That may
now.
not be fair in current circumstances, but there's a giant what if there. And what I'll challenge is not that it's impossible. It's certainly not impossible. But it is an extreme low likelihood event because the case that you're alluding to in 2010, the sneak attack on the South Korean naval vessel, the Jonan, that cost the lives of 48 sailors, was an ambush. It was a sneak attack. It took advantage of a lapse in good warcraft by the crew. And North Korea had every intention of avoiding attribution by preventing the world from finding out that, in fact, it had staged this attack. North Korea has pretty scrupulously avoided actions that would put at risk American lives because of the confidence that North Korean leaders have had, and I don't see any reason to think Kim Jong-un is a departure from that, that the United States would respond in a very forceful way to any direct attack. So I think that that fact, combined with the fact that with the anomalous exception of a mine planted in the DMZ, which is also a sort of booby trap, the North Koreans under Kim Jong-un have set aside their bag of tricks in terms of military actions, what's called kinetic attacks, thus far, in favor of a single-minded pursuit of the threat profile made up of ballistic missiles and nuclear capability. I don't think that there is any real doubt in North Korea's mind that the American response to an attack, any attack, either on the United States or the South Koreans, would be met with a very forceful and very dangerous, for North Korea, strong response. The North Koreans know a great deal about American military capability. they track the comings and goings and the deployments of the U.S. forces, Korea, and the combined forces command very, very closely. And I think that the proof is in the nuclear program. North Korea has largely given up on a quest for conventional military parity with the South or with the U.S. and instead has looked to nuclear weapons. Now, the North claims that it's pursuing nuclear weapons for defensive purposes. It claims that the U.S. is pursuing a hostile policy and that it's in great and imminent danger. That's not true, and there's no basis for making that argument. Moreover, if nuclear weapons were purely defensive, why would North Korea need ballistic missiles, ICBMs? Why would it need not just one, but dozens? The fact of the matter is that North Korea isn't in the fighting business. North Korea is in the threatening business. And one of the reasons that the sanctions campaign makes sense is that unless and until North Korea is able to derive tangible benefits from that threat, a return on that investment, then all North Korea has is a nuclear weapon that it can't use. And so ensuring that North Korea doesn't profit from its crime has been, and I think needs to continue to be, the sine qua non of our combined strategy.
That's really well put. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, I'm Bruce Cole. I'm a CPA representing no one. What is, two simple questions that don't need a lot of elaboration. What is the most common reaction that you've had dealing with North Korea's neighbors when people talk to you candidly? And the same question when you talk to the neighboring countries in the South China Sea, what do they say about China's policy in the Nanhai of militarizing some of the islands? What's the most common complaint or remark that you've heard candidly from other diplomats there? Thank you.
Well, I think that by far and away, in terms of the views of North Korea among the neighboring countries, the strongest point of consensus is that war would be a disaster and something to avoid at all costs. I think that there is, notwithstanding the hand-wringing that I mentioned at the outset, there is an abiding faith that the U.S. deterrence is sufficient to prevent North Korea from initiating hostilities, but there's also a companion concern that too much pressure could cause the regime to enter into a sort of Samson-like temple destruction, bringing chaos down not only on Pyongyang but on Seoul and other capitals. In terms of the South China Sea, I think that if the way to look at it is to take a step back. The way that I would distill the prevailing view among the countries in Southeast Asia is that they do not want to have to make a choice between Beijing and Washington. They don't want to be presented with an either-or sort of Cold War, whose side are you on, stark option. They want to have their cake and eat it too. And that's, particularly in this case, not only reasonable, it's a good thing. And U.S. policy has been to act in ways that prevent countries from being coerced into making that choice, but by the same token to protect their right to make their own choices, to shield them from coercion to the maximum extent. The development, the reclamation of land and the construction of these outposts in the Spratlys, which at various points has been justified by Chinese authorities as merely responding to what other claimants like Vietnam and the Philippines were doing, really bears no resemblance whatsoever to the very, very minor and modest reclamation or construction work that Vietnam and the Philippines have done over the years. I forget the statistics, but if there was 50 or 60 acres in total of reclaimed land in these little islands by either of the other claimants, I'd be surprised, whereas there are thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of reclaimed land in the Chinese outposts that have been built up, layered with concrete, and on which patently military facilities have been constructed. There's no way to look at those facilities as anything other than military outposts. And notwithstanding Chinese insistence early on that these are just shelters for seamen, for fishermen against typhoons, and they're open to everybody, et cetera, the fact is that surface-to-air missiles, hangars for strike fighters, ports for warships, all of these facilities, along with radar, create an offensive platform clearly for the purpose of coercion, clearly for the purpose of exercising military control. Now, on the one hand, you can argue, as some Chinese do, that that's rich coming from the Americans, whose Seventh Fleet is operating constantly in the South China Sea. But the important point here is that no one on the U.S. side has ever for a moment suggested that the PLA Navy doesn't have identical rights to the U.S. Navy. There's nothing in the world stopping a Chinese aircraft carrier or its missile frigates or any other ship or plane from flying where international law allows, just like the United States does. But to actually seize contested territory, to actually seek unilaterally to exercise national authority over international waters, to create permanent military bases that impinge on the territory or the EEZ and the rights of sovereign states, small states, is not only wrong, it's a mistake. Because it has generated indelible and enduring misgivings about China's intent and China's long-term strategy. And I'll just confess, as an American diplomat, that I have, over the years, just hurled myself at this brick wall with my Chinese friends and counterparts, urging them to think carefully and to act more cautiously. It may be that the foreign minister and the foreign ministry don't have a vote. The PLA, after all, is not a national military. It's a party armed organ. The government in China, unlike in the U.S. or democracies, is deeply subordinate to the party. So it may be that there's no lack of trying on their part, but the fact is that this militarization has not only continued, but has really damaged, I think, China's hopes of being seen as a fair and benign power in the region.
There's a question here. I'd love some gender diversity in the questions, but maybe the next one. Yes, sir.
Sorry, I can't help you with that. My name is Christian Merck. I'm with APCO Worldwide. And I'd like to ask you to go back to the North Korean situation and expand your discussion of it in two respects. One is there has recently been a comment, which I don't know how seriously to take it, that the U.S. might withdraw from KORUS. So I wonder if you would offer your views of KORUS. First of all, is it of its implementation? Is it actually an effective trade agreement? And secondly, is it important strategically to the U.S.-Korean alliance? And should we, in the business community, be concerned about its present prospects? And then the second aspect, which I'm interested in because I don't know really very much about it, is what the Russian security interest and strategic interest in North Korea might be. Every now and then you get a kind of Olympian comment from Mr. Putin about how nobody is doing this in the right way, but I wonder what the underlying strategic interests of Russia are, in your view.
Thank you. Well, those are two great questions. I take the threat to abrogate the U.S.-Korea free trade agreement very, very seriously. And I think that it probably had an extremely near miss a week or so ago when there was a serious discussion within the administration about whether the time had come to jettison it. The U.S. Trade Representative Lighthizer issued a statement saying that, in effect, that it was under review, but no action would be taken in the short term. And I suspect that there are more strategic arguments mustered in the White House than there were economic arguments mustered. There's a cottage industry of people who criticize KORUS for not having done enough and point to continued difficulties faced by U.S. companies seeking to access the Korean market, as well as the statistics in terms of trade in goods. My colleague in Washington, Wendy Cutler, was one of the parents and champions of and negotiators for the KORUS agreement, and has written, I think, usefully on the subject pretty recently. What I would say to draw from her analysis is that it is true that the KORUS agreement that we wound up with and that we're living with was largely hatched more than 10 years ago. And without a doubt, there are aspects of the agreement that need to be, that would benefit from being modernized, including on digital trade and other aspects of the knowledge-based digital economy that were less visible, in the days before the iPhone. And so that fact, combined with the data set, the track record that we have of authentic information about what has and hasn't worked under KORUS, constitute the basis for a very significant, very valuable relook. And indeed, there may be parts of the agreement that should be revisited or revised. I think that Wendy makes a strong case that the argument mustered by the Korean government that we need a facts-based review, that any discussion of how to change KORUS needs to be informed by an accurate assessment of what the shape of trade has been as a result of KORUS is perfectly sensible. And it's my hope that rather than a throw the baby out with the bathwater approach, that we will ultimately get a joint exploration of how any of the shortcomings of Chorus can be remedied. In terms of Russia, I'm revealing my prejudice here, but I think that one of the strategic interests that would explain the behavior of the Russian government under Putin vis-a-vis North Korea is an interest in recreating a security arrangement, a security architecture in Northeast Asia that significantly weakens the U.S. alliance system. And I found that those areas where Russia has most vigorously made common cause with China have been in opposition to the U.S. presence in South Korea, the U.S. military presence in Japan, and by and large sort of aimed at trying to pry apart the network of security partnerships that have helped keep Asia stable and formed the basis of prosperity for the last 6+ decades. Now, there is a lot of sort of Wild West color to the actual engagement by Russian firms and entrepreneurs with North Korea, but I don't believe that Moscow considers that it has a major strategic stake in how the North Korean issue plays out, other than the shared interest in avoiding thermonuclear war. In the past, the Soviet and then the Russian diplomats were the fiercest guardians of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the disarmament and arms control regimes, and on that basis were really vigorous in opposing the North Korean nuclear program. I think that under Putin, they have found it more advantageous to align with China tactically and to make mischief for the U.S., South Korea, and Japan than to defend these global non-proliferation principles. And that's really a big loss, I think, for the world.
We have time for one more question. Peggy, it's yours. Sorry. Yep. Go ahead.
Peggy Blumenthal from the Institute of International Education. A few days ago, we had a wonderful panel here at the Asia Society of 3 very different people coming from very different perspectives, and the only thing they did agree on, which was that if China and Japan could actually get together, there really is no need for America to be present in the Asian region, and but then they also agreed that there was almost no chance that China and Japan would get together. I'm wondering about your views on, is there an ongoing need for America to be present in the region if China and Japan could get their act together?
There's a what if.
Another what if, but it's an easy abstract one.
I don't think that this is an either-or proposition. The United States is a Pacific nation, and the United States is a superpower, and our presence continues to serve a stabilizing and pacifying function, not merely as an outgrowth of the Second World War, not merely as a vestige of the Cold War, but because the U.S. presence is something that is largely either welcomed or viewed as benign by the countries in East Asia. And it may be that geography plays a role in it, because it's clear that, apart from a spasm of colonialism in the turn of the century, 2 centuries ago, that the U.S. has no designs on any territory and has no territorial disputes whatsoever in East Asia. But I think it goes far beyond that. That the United States has won a record largely as a dispassionate, honest broker. I don't mean to be patting myself on the back, but it's certainly been my experience in Asia that not only is the U.S. security presence welcomed for our, being the responder of first resort in natural disasters and crises. Not only are we welcomed because we provide valued training and exercises, not just to our allies, but to all kinds of partners, including China. But that the unresolved tensions among Asian countries, and I'm not limiting that to Japan and China or Japan and Korea, because Asia is rich with historical grudges, with territorial disputes, with ethnic and religious enmities, and so on. But the ongoing and sustained presence of and active participation of the United States in the security as well as the economic and cultural life of East Asia is regarded as a powerful stabilizing force. That said, U.S. interests would be hugely advantaged by a better political relationship between China and Japan. And I would add, particularly in the aftermath of the beating that South Korea has taken from the Lotte group on down, would benefit from better relations between China and South Korea. And of course, as the hard work of President Obama shows, better relations between Seoul and Tokyo. The economic relationship between Japan and China is one of mutual dependence. But the political relationship is one of mutual suspicion. I have my own views about what some of the modern drivers are. Certainly, the Chinese Communist Party has made vilification of Japan a centerpiece of its populist agenda. But I still harbor the hope that in the future that the efforts that are being made, certainly by Prime Minister Abe and his government, could start to bear fruit in terms of steady improvements in the Sino-Japan relationship.
Thank you, Danny. And I'm mindful of the time. Just a couple of notes as we close. First of all, the next iteration of the Asia Briefing series at this same hour will be on the 4th of October. We'll be at the eve of the IMF World Bank gatherings in Washington. We'll have the chief global economics editor for the Financial Times, Rana Farahar, will be here. And secondly, one thing we didn't talk about, Danny, and you don't want to pat yourself on the back, but I will, is sort of who's running all these policies at the moment, in Korea in particular. There, at the moment, still is no successor in place at Danny's past position as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific. There is no sitting ambassador in Seoul. So we're very grateful to have you and your wisdom, but I do wish those positions would get filled, and I'm sure you do too. But please join me in thanking Danny Russel for joining us today. Thanks, Danny.